Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Hello to anyone who's listening to this on the Temple Beth Am podcast, and B'teavon to whoever's eating Cheerios in Larry Herman's house. Could be Larry, could be Izzy, it's hard to know. Cheerios are good for everybody. I'll spend 15 seconds on this and no more. Today, like every day, one of the most proper things that a Jewish person should do is to do a deep dive into our ancient texts, try to learn timeless wisdom, and figure out how to live them out in our lives, no matter what world we're waking up into. So it's eminently appropriate that we're spending an hour today studying Torah. We should be spending an hour a day studying Torah every day, no matter what the headlines are, whether we're thrilled or we are devastated. So we're going to jump right into it. We are in chapter 11 of the book of Exodus. We read verse 5, but did not do the Rashis on it. So I want to go back and do the Rashi and reread the verse and then do the Rashi. Okay. Just to give you, to remind you where we are, we're in the second verse of the fourth Aliyah. And Moses is speaking to whom we don't know, because again, we've discussed many times, Moshe has already left Pharaoh's presence according to the standard pshat in the Torah. But Moshe is speaking to someone. And in verse 4, he had said that around midnight, I, meaning God, am going to come amidst the Egyptians. And in verse 5, Umeit kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim. Mate looks like it's past tense, but it's future tense, vav hayipuch. And every firstborn in the land of Egypt will die. Mi bechor paro, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, Hayushev al-Kiso, who's sitting on his throne. The sitting on his throne is modifying Pharaoh, not modifying the firstborn. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne. Ad, all the way until Bechor HaShivcha, the child of even the maidservant, Asher Achar HaRechaim, the maidservant who spends all day on the grindstone. Why the preposition Achar is used. Achar doesn't only mean after. It can also mean adjacent to. The Chol Bechor Behema, and also the firstborn of the animals. We had a lot of questions on that verse. We dealt with a few of the questions. If there are any lingering questions in the verse, we can spend some time on it, and or we can jump right into Rashi. Any lingering questions or comments on that verse itself, what the words mean, and what the content is? Going once? Okay, take a microphone. Do me a favor, take the microphones off the stands and put the stands somewhere else. I think the stands are making background. Just put the stands on a different table.
Yeah.
Like off the table.
Yeah. Why, in describing the slave woman, why add the phrase, who is behind the millstone?
Yeah.
What does that add? Why do you do it if you say you're going to be killing everyone? What difference does it make if she's behind the millstone or doing something else?
Or where Pharaoh's sitting.
Excuse me?
Or where Pharaoh is sitting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you could make the argument that there's something about amplifying Pharaoh's status, not that Pharaoh needs amplification to say that, yes, that very same Pharaoh who is in charge of everything sits on the throne, like that parenthetical clause can sort of make sense. Alan's question is, what is it about the sitting near or behind the grindstone that makes the reference to the slave woman that much more interesting, right? It's an interesting question that very few of any people of the classic commentators are even curious about. Rashi's not curious about it at all. Maybe I'm totally conjecturing here. There are certain images in societies that become commonplace or notable. And it may just be that one of the images in the ancient world was a lowly maidservant. What kind of lowly maidservant? The one who spends all day grinding wheat. Right? It could be that we're just seeing a remnant of an idiom or a remnant of a normalcy that made its way into the text that to an ancient reader would have been the perfect counterpoint. Pharaoh sitting on his high throne and the maidservant sitting on her low throne. What's the low throne that the maidservant sits on? That low stool that you have to sit on to be so focused on the grinding of the wheat for your master, something like that. Just a guess. Norm.
I think it may have been that it was the lowest possible social caste because it's something that's done outside. and maidservants generally working inside somebody's home or palace or whatever. But this is something that's done outside, and in many societies, the outside servant is considered a lower person than an inside servant. Certainly, that was true in the American South.
Yeah, and also just maybe a reference to the person in society who is responsible for nothing sexier than just creating the basic provisions for the society, just the grinding the grain to produce the wheat that is the standard bearer calorie for the ancient society, right? Could be something like that. And it could have made perfect sense to a different generation than ours. We don't think of the wheat grinder as being the opposite of the president of the United States, but it might have been thought of as the opposite of the pharaoh. Yes, Tova, let's get Tova, Mike.
I just had a question. If you could remind me, I know that it's debated when they speak of the firstborn, whether they're speaking of the firstborn of the father or of the mother. And since in this case, Pharaoh is a man and the maidservant is the maidservant, can you remind me what the outcome of that debate was? And if it has any bearing of the fact that they divide it between a man and a woman?
Yeah, I don't know that I can resolve it simply. That's fine, because the notion of a bechor in halach terminology is usually thought of as peter rechem, the one who burst through the womb, right? So in Jewish law, the pidyon haben, right, only goes to a bechor if that bechor is the firstborn child of that woman and happens to be a male and was not born cesarean section, right? And so it's potential that a Jewish man could have several pidyon haben amongst his offspring if he kept marrying a different woman and she kept having a firstborn man, right? That's what it means halachically, and there are also certain verses in the Torah that make that rather explicit. That does not necessarily mean that the only thing that the Hebrew word bechor means in the Torah is that, right? There's no reason to believe that this use of the word bechor has to mean firstborn of the women of Egypt. It might just mean firstborn, even though in the context when Jewish law is being described, it gets connected to the woman's womb. Yeah. Sandy, give Sandy a mic.
So with Yaakov Reuven was the bechor until he lost that status. Was also Yosef then really a bechor, or was it just the firstborn of the father?
Right, that's a really good counterpoint. So in the narrative of our tradition, there's a reference to firstborns of the fathers, right? So I think that's making the noise. The microphones are like really sensitive. So, yeah. Okay. So right, Reuven is considered the bechor of Jacob, even though he's not the only halachic, that's an anachronism, bechor in the family, because Rachel's firstborn Joseph would have been obligated to a pidyon haben if that were in place at the time. Correct. So it's a good reminder that the word can sometimes mean in the narrative part just the firstborn of that male, even though according to Jewish law it's the firstborn of the female. In terms of, I don't think there's anything in Jewish law that relates to the firstborn that is not dependent on the mother, right? Including, by the way, let me say this out loud before I think it's the case. In terms of the fast of the firstborn, which obviously stems from the story, because every firstborn male is born with a pledge owed to God for having spared those firstborns. I actually don't remember if that applies both or either to the firstborn of a woman or a man. I don't even remember. I'm not a firstborn, so I haven't thought about it a long time in terms of my own obligation. I don't know if the fast of the firstborn that you normally get out of by going to a siyum erev Pesach, it's incumbent upon you. It's certainly incumbent upon you if you're the firstborn of your mother. I don't know if it's the firstborn of your father, but not your mother. To check it out. Yeah, Tova and then Barry, and then I see Rick's hand.
Just coming back to it, I'm just wondering, well, two different directions. One, the fact that they chose to have the example of a man and a woman could lead in the direction of that this is wholesale, that the firstborn of the men and firstborn of women both will be killed, which makes it sort of even more striking. But the other thing could be a completely different approach, was that the choice of using the handmaid at the millstone was, in fact, because if you're trying to find the lowest of the low, both it's the hardest, lowest work, but it's also a woman who would be a lower status than a male servant. So
really helpful comment, right? That the merism of the pharaoh and the maidservant is not just about high low, but like kind of quasi halachically the firstborn of any person, whether male or female, possible. Barry and then Rick, and then I see Larry.
I a parentheses here to let us know that this is the Shifcha is an Egyptian woman. These are the firstborn only of Egyptians.
Well, we don't know that they're Egyptians. We just know that they're not Israelites. They might be other enslaved or indentured people in ancient Egypt, but it doesn't say that they're Egyptian.
So, are we to assume now that the firstborn of humans could be any humans other than Israelites in Egypt, or only the firstborn of Egyptians in Egypt?
From the language of the verse, we don't know. All we know is that it's setting up from an A to a Z, and the A is high male status, and the Z is low female status. But there's nothing about the word shivcha that determines whether or not that is an Egyptian woman who is a handmaid to another Egyptian, or another ancient population that was also either enslaved or indentured by the ruling class. Yeah. Rick, and then Larry or Diane, and then Leonard. Leonard, was your hand up also?
Yeah.
Also, I know this changes every week. Today, the microphones are very sensitive. So some weeks I say, put it close to your mouth. And today I'm saying, keep it a little far from your mouth. Just to keep you on your toes. Okay, Rick.
Hi. I'm only bringing this up because we talked about.
Rick, speak a little bit lower because all of our volume in this room is really high. So do like a sotto voce.
Okay. How's this?
It's a little better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Really?
Pretend like
Wow.
you're doing, like a DJ on a soft rock channel.
I could whisper if you like.
You're about to introduce like an Air Supply song or something. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'd like to bring up the verse that we went to last week, which was 12 and 29.
Okay.
Where the components, I love that you said A to Z. The component for A is the same. Then there's a middle component, and then there's more. So I just wanted to bring it up, and there's Rashi there that explains why the handmaid and all this, and you can do whatever you like. I just want to tell you what I'm seeing. Okay. So in this verse 5, the A is mi bechor paro hayoshev al kiso. That's the same in 29. Same trope. Mi bechor paro hayoshev al kiso. The next phrase up to the et nachta, ad bechor hashivcha asher achar harechaim is here. Over there, it's ad, same thing, bechor hashvi asher beveit habor, which is much lower than the handmaiden working on the millstones. And then it ends the same, v'chol b'chor behema, in both places. So those three pieces, Pharaoh, and then something in the middle, and then b'chor behema, the bookends are the same. It's the middle that's different. And I'd like to say the grain from the days of Joseph, the grain was very important. So maybe the woman working on the mill, I mean, obviously she's not in prison in the bottom of a pit. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up.
Great. It's a really interesting comparison. If everyone flip forward to verse 29. So in our verse 5, 12:9. In our verse, it's Moses describing in God's voice what's going to happen. By verse 12, chapter 12, it's happening. And you're right, the middle piece is no longer a she on a grindstone, but a reference, or at least the noun shvi is a male noun, and is in some kind of a a cistern, or it could be a reference to prison, the same, or a deep hole, the same way that Joseph was in there. So something has shifted by the time the story is happening as opposed to being predicted. And of course, you could approach that many different ways. Is this two different textual traditions and they weren't completely synthesized? Or is there some reason, if you want to take the most traditional approach to it, that the prediction, the prophecy is about her on the grindstone, but when it actually happened, I don't know, it went even farther down the chain to the person not only who is working as an indentured or a servant in the Egyptian home, but actually imprisoned by the Egyptian population. Yeah, good. Larry, Diane, and then Leonard.
We both have a comment. Mine isn't particularly helpful, except, no, okay, I'm sorry. Except the adding the firstborn of cattle, or later on beasts, I guess is it Behemot in chapter 12?
And chapter 12 is V'chol Bechor Behema.
Yeah, so it's Behema, and here.
Literally the same thing, same exact phrase. And all the firstborn of the flock, the animal. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Because I just noticed that Alter translates it differently, does he? Maybe not. That's not my point.
Translates that phrase differently in each verse?
Yeah, that wasn't the point I wanted to make, but let me just check.
Okay.
No, he does. He translates it the same. Not cattle, but as beasts. Doesn't matter. My point being, there is almost no way to tell who is the firstborn of a bull. You can only tell the firstborn of a cow. Unless you're controlling beyond the actual capability.
A lot of cameras in the stables.
Right. So I only raise that issue because you're talking about whether it's the firstborn of a male pharaoh or the firstborn of a female. My explanation, which doesn't mean anything, is they probably weren't making the distinction very, very carefully to begin with, or however this was written. But if you want to make a point of the pharaoh versus the slave girl, if you add the cattle, it simply confuses the matter tremendously.
Yeah. Tova, do you have a sense of whether or not the Torah's presumption of family structure in ancient Egypt was that the pharaoh would have had more than one wife or woman or concubine?
Certainly at the time. Oh, sorry.
Okay, sorry.
At the time that that this would have occurred, if we're looking at it as being historical, certainly at the time later, the pharaohs did, like the 19th dynasty pharaohs had very large numbers of wives because they were much more internationally involved at that time, and there was a lot of exchange of brides. So they had, very large. In fact, there was a harem conspiracy that ended up in the assassination of one of the rabbis, Lahavdil, one of the pharaohs. Right.
Just note, everyone. Just note the comparison that Tova's unconscious burped into the world.
Yes. Because the wives would conspire to get their sons.
So that would have been my suspicion, that we would presume both historically and inside the text that the pharaoh was not monogamous. Then it does push the question of what the Torah literally meant by Bechor Paro. Did it literally mean Pharaoh's firstborn of all of his wives, or each of his firstborns from his many wives, right? There's no way of resolving that, but I don't think I've ever really quite thought about that before. Leonard's hand was up a long time ago.
Diane wanted to say something too.
Oh, all right. Okay. Diane.
Yeah, I want to go back to the cattle, because this rings similarly to the last line of the book of Jonah, and also many cattle.
Yeah.
And so it's fascinating, the comparison between there's people and somehow there's a lot of other animals, but somehow cattle have this status of you either care about them or you put them in the same category as the people that you're going to smite them. It's very interesting.
Yeah, well, Rashi's going to have an explanation for why the cattle might have been smitten. And by the way, translation problem, we shouldn't be 100% certain that the translation of behema is cattle, right? Because behema also means beast, right? And it might have meant the most common large beast of that civilization, which was cattle, or may not. Like it's a good guess, but it's still a guess that it's actually cows, like that species that we're being referred to in that verse. Okay, Leonard, Norm, and then Sandy, and then Tova. We're going to read a Rashi today, I promise.
Actually, I wanted to be last in this thing here, but that's okay.
Do you want me to? Oh, I can call on this first.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Okay, Norm.
Probably in most cases, if the cow or ewe has its firstborn killed, that will include the firstborn of the bull or ram. Although it's conceivable that's not always true. But Rashi does, when we get to chapter 12, offer an explanation as to why that middle phrase is different, and it seems a pretty reasonable explanation to me.
All right, so everyone will wait expectantly for that in July of 2026. Sandy.
I think
Good?
let's do Rashi.
Okay. Leonard, final. Oh, no. Tova. No, it's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Leonard.
He wants to go last.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to put in a speculation, and I'll do some research because I don't have the answer, that the firstborn of the beasts, I don't know if it was the case in Egypt that the sacrifices that were offered to the gods were preferentially the firstborn of beasts, but it would be interesting if I'll do some research if that was the case, because then that has implications beyond.
Good. Thank you. I always like it when Tova does her research. It thickens our experience in class. Okay, Leonard.
Hi. So I just.
Sorry, we don't have time. Let's go to the. Go ahead.
So since we're talking about Rashi now, I just wanted to point out that this is the first time that I've seen where the Dibur Matchil doesn't appear in the verse. Although it does appear in verse 29, it doesn't appear in this verse.
Right. So again, the Dibur Matchil, the words literally mean the starting words. It's the Hebrew phrase to denote the words on which Rashi's commentary is written. And as we said many times, probably not original to Rashi. And in many, not all versions of Rashi on this verse, the phrase that's quoted from the verse as the Dibur Matchil doesn't appear in the verse. It's actually the one that appears in chapter 12, verse 29. So we probably have 4 or 5 different Rashis around the table. Does anybody have that the opening words of the first comment of Rashi on verse 5 is not Ad Bechor Hashvi, which is the language of chapter 12, verse 29, but rather the words that actually appear in our Torah, Ad Bechor Hashivcha? Anyone have Shivcha as their Dibur HaMatchil in the Rashi? Renee? No? Okay. And that can mean any number of things, and you have to have a much higher scholarly understanding of Rashi than I do to be able to answer it. It could mean A, unlikely, Rashi had a different version of the Torah than we had. There are a couple of places where we have instances of medieval commentators having slight changes in their inherited canonized Torah than we do. Certainly in the Talmud we have that, but even to the Middle Ages. Or in which case Rashi really thought he was commenting on the words Ad Bechor Hashvi, in which case the point that Rick was making before would be unintelligible to Rashi because he was saying, no, they are the same. Or more likely, some editor or annotator along the way made the jump in it's probably his head, thinking about the 2 verses, wrote this down while he was thinking about chapter 12, verse 29, and then that got codified as an error. Sometimes errors get codified. Does anyone, Barry, can I see the Torah Chaim a second? Because that is the most scholarly of the versions of it. I want to see if it says anything.
I have a footnote. Although the phrase
Go ahead.
appears further on 1229 rather than our verse, Rashi comments on it here to. Do I need a microphone?
You're not in the microphone.
Although the phrase appears in 1229 rather than our verse, Rashi comments on it here to explain an obvious difficulty, given that the firstborn of the captives did
Right. So there's a footnote number 29. If you have this version of the Mikro says the same thing, which basically saying that yes, Rashi knew he was quoting verse 29 of the next chapter, and he's quoting that to try to synthesize the two different versions of this story. One when it's being prophesied, and one when it's happening. What it might mean, again, Rashi did not write his own Divrei Matchil. It might be that Rashi began his comment not by quoting this verse, but by saying, "Oh, reader, you probably also know the next version of this, which is in chapter 12, verse 21. He quotes that, and then that got transmuted into a Dibur HaMatchil in future editions. So now it appears as the bold, but it may not have been what Rashi meant. Rashi was, because Rashi didn't do that in general. Rashi just starts his comment. Yeah. Okay, Leonard?
I had one more thing to say.
Please.
About the slave there behind the millstone.
Yeah.
So I can't tell you what the exact hierarchy, and status was in Egypt, but I can tell you in England, a miller was about the lowest as you could get. And in fact, all those people who are named Miller weren't named. They started out as Müllers in German. And because in Germany it had a higher status, and so that wasn't so bad to be called that. But to be called a miller from English would have been a terrible, like calling yourself a trash collector as your last name,
as it were. Great, Renee, your hand is up, and then we're going to read the Rashi. This is the last comment before the Rashi.
So, according to my search here, according to Jewish tradition, a firstborn of a father is required to fast on the fast of the firstborn, according to Ta'anit Brachot. So even if a child is not the firstborn child born to the mother, the firstborn son of their father has to observe the fast. But the Shulchan Aruch ruling is that a firstborn to a father alone is obligated to fast.
Alone meaning, and even if it's not the first, well, no.
Not of the mother, that only the father.
Yeah. But no one can hear you, Rachel.
Just your comment, Rabbi, about if you have a harem and you have a large number of firstborns, if it's the one alone that needs to fast, that's 1 out of 40 or 50 offspring.
Well, Cecil B. DeMille certainly understood it to be Pharaoh's firstborn, right? That's seen as clearly the first progeny that Pharaoh puts into the world. And I wonder if the reason why the halakha that obligates Jewish men to fast on that day is oddly referring to Pharaoh's experience of his first issue, right? And that actually then gets converted into Jewish practice. Fascinating. Okay, we're going to read the Rashi. So Ad Bechor Hashvi, or Ad Bechor Hashivcha, right? Most of us have it listed as Ad Bechor Hashvi. Alan, do you want to read this?
Sure.
Microphone.
Ad Bechor Hashvi, to the firstborn of the captive. Lama Laku Hashvuyim. Why were the captives smitten by the plague?
And just to sharpen the point, whatever we think of the status of the woman by the grindstone, a captive is lower, right? So it's almost as if Rashi's saying, without trying to weigh in as to whether his first 3 words are quoting what he thinks this verse is or going ahead to chapter 12, Rashi is making his comment on a wider chasm. Pharaoh to woman on the grindstone is narrower than Pharaoh to captive. So why were even the captives, he might say, as we're going to find in chapter 12:29, why were even they smitten? Go ahead.
Okay. Kidei shalo yomeru uritem.
Yir atam.
Tava el bonam.
Hard language.
Yeah. I could just read the translation.
Their elbows. So that
okay, so that's right. So that no one would say Yir Atam.
What does Yir Atam literally mean? their fear, their
yeah.
awe. But you might remember earlier on, Rashi made the comment that to refer to someone's awe might also refer to the thing about which someone has awe, which means it could be a reference to their deity. In this sentence of Rashi, Yir Atam means the object of their awe, meaning the gods that they believed in, so that no one could claim that it was the foreign gods that other Egyptian captives, not Israelites, believed in. Tava el bonam. What is tava? Taf bet ayin? That's with a tet, right? Taf is to claim as being owed. To be in a court case, if you're making a claim that someone owes you money, it's your tava otam, right? You're asking a lien be put on someone. El bonam, their shame. El bon is shame.
Yeah.
It's very like terse language to put it in a normal English sentence. Rashi's saying, lest other non-Israelite captives of Egypt, who were also humiliated and embarrassed and degraded by the Egyptians, lest they be able to claim that all the bad things that are happening to the Egyptians are happening because of their praying to their idols deep in the prisons. They get smitten even though they did nothing wrong, so that it's 100% clear that who's doing the smiting? God of the Israelites, right? So this is some pretty severe collateral damage, right? You are enslaved or captive by the Egyptians. You have your own misery. You pray out to your gods because you also want to be saved. God comes and smites the Egyptians, but God smites you to so there's no plausible explanation to suggest that it was your prayers to your God that did it. It was only the Israelites' prayers to the Israelite God that did it, right? That's what that phrase means. Okay. Keep going.
Yeah.
I actually interrupted in the middle of the sentence.
No, it just so that they shouldn't say that their pagan deity demanded satisfaction for their degradation. Vahavia por anut al mitzrayim. Al mitzrayim. That's the footnote 4. All right, and they brought punishment,
calamity, right?
Yeah, punishment, calamity on the Egyptians.
Right. So if you are a captive of the Egyptian society, and retribution is coming to the Egyptians, but you're suffering too, then no one can claim it's because of your God. Your God isn't the one doing the rescuing; otherwise, you would have been rescued. Okay. Thoughts or comments on that, Elon?
So, as you rightfully said, it's very disturbing because Rashi clearly is disturbed by the sentence, and he's trying to no. Don't get me wrong; these guys actually deserve. It's like a lame. It's severely lame. Like the fact that he could think that this takes a disturbing sentence in the Torah and kind of makes it better is disturbing. I wonder, did he really think, okay, now it's fine, now I get it, this is the explanation, so that they didn't get confused and think that it was their gods that actually got everyone off the hook. Now I'm comfortable with it, we can go on with our lives.
To put even a finer point on that comment, sometimes when we come across a midrash or a commentary that's hard to swallow, it's okay to ask ourselves, okay, what's the sermon here? Like, even if it's hard to swallow, is there a sermon here whose lesson is edifying? And it's very hard to figure out if Rashi is using this commentary as his drash basis for his drash that week in France. What's the sermon? It's hard to figure out. But he had another option available to him that he didn't take, which is given by other commentaries in Midrashim on another aspect of Exodus night that is hard to explain, right? The whole notion of the blood on the lintel, right? One of the standard questions asked on that is, if God is omniscient, why did God need a map to figure out which houses should have been spared, right? Couldn't God have told the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, right, smite this home and not the other home? And the midrash on that, which is troubling, but at least there's a bit of sermonica in it, is that once the destroyer is released, it's indiscriminate. Even by God, once a negative force is released upon a certain context, that not even a God can keep it in check, right? I could write an interesting sermon about that, right? Whether or not it's the right explanation for that verse, there's an interesting sermon to be written about how much control you do not wield once one's rage or one's fury or one's hate gets released. It just hits everyone, even the good tissue, right? So Rashi could have said that here, right? But didn't. Rashi could have said, why? Because once God decided to smite, like that smiting power could no longer distinguish even amongst the people who were otherwise innocent. Rashi doesn't say that, which is even more interesting / troubling.
Well, there are also other times where we've encountered where there's a disturbing passage and Rashi just doesn't comment on it, which I would actually almost prefer, because to me, the implication of that is, okay, this is a disturbing passage. I'm not going to try to justify it intellectually because there is no justification, so we'll just let it sit. His attempt to tackle it is God watching. Exactly.
Yeah. Larry, Diane, and then Sandy. Or maybe it's Izzy who wants to comment.
It could well be. We'll see. I have a couple of real quick ones. The first one is I'm going to go back to the to the Rashi, the first words. I forget what you call them. Forgive me.
The singular is Dibur Hamatchil or Diburei Hamatchil, the beginning words.
Diburei Hamatchil. It just, I think you all know, as I said in the past, that my vision is that the Rashi we have is basically a compendium of the notes of his students, perhaps, maybe they didn't see, and just sort of suggests to me that there was, in the editing or compiling of it, there was confusion between the two verses, 12:29 and this verse. In reading, maybe I misheard you because I was paying attention to Izzy, but in reading the English translation in Sfaria, which I think comes from Silverman, of the first one, it says
English translation of Rashi commentary.
Right. It says the translation here of Kadesh Shelo Yomru, in order that these might not say that their God had claimed satisfaction for the humiliation imposed upon them and had brought this punishment upon the Egyptians. So maybe you said this, or maybe it's clear to everybody. In other words, that others couldn't say it wasn't the Hebrew God that did this, it was my God that did this.
So to make that not possible to say, correct.
Right. To make it not possible to say, they got smitten. So
yeah, that's the very thing I think Elon is struggling with. Like, how does that make any sense in a world of ethics?
No, I understand. Right. Well, why they are smitten at all doesn't make sense. Even if they were, I had read it originally slightly differently. That not that they would claim that their God did it, but that they would claim, well, this is also because I'm suffering, whether my God did it or not. But no.
I see. It's not even that our pain is a part of the calculus here, independent of who's doing it. Our pain is not being considered at all in this divine retribution upon Egypt.
And I only want to say this now because we're going to get to it in a minute when we get to the second Rashi, but Elon's going to get even more upset, I think, justifiably, in the second Rashi.
Mm-hmm. It won't be the most upset that Elon has been in a week. And I think, and I praise your optimism, Larry, when you say that we're going to get to it in a minute.
Okay. Well, I'll stop then. I'll stop here so we can get to it.
Okay. Yeah, Sandy.
I don't know if Rashi is defending God. I think he's just explaining it. It's the whole purpose of the slavery, the whole purpose of the Exodus, the whole purpose of the plagues has just been, is it since the prophecy back in the thing is just to say this is going to happen, and all of the slaves who have suffered for 400 years, it's all been to show that God is the one God, and he took them out of Egypt, and he is going to show society. And like, what would it look like for him if he left like this one little loophole, in his grand plan that he's been, talking about for, since before any of these people even existed. So I think it's more just he may have agreed with what God was doing, but I don't think he's offering apologetics. I think he's just explaining like, nope, this was a complete plan and there were no stone left unturned. It was a complete, thought through process.
It had to happen this way. It was brutal.
Yeah.
Deal with it. Oh, it's the only way. It's the only way we could have gotten out of Egypt. Something like that.
No, not even that they got out of Egypt. It was God's plan from before the plagues, from before the slavery, from everything, that this was the way that the story was going to unfold.
Yeah.
And that is it.
Yeah.
No justifications either. Like not my team.
Right.
I was just looking at the Rashi under 1229. So it says really that it's a further explanation of why the firstborn of the captives not wanting them to be able to claim it was their God who did it, their deity. But the primary reason, it sounds like Rashi is saying, is that they rejoiced at the misfortune of the Israelites.
Yeah, and Rashi is going to say a version of that on our verse 2, but on one of the upcoming parts.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Right. Which may or may not, like, if Elon buys that, which is a big if, may or may not soften the discomfort. Right. If we buy the argument which we're about to read, which is that not only were they, subjects of the oppression of the Egyptians, but they also had a little bit of Schadenfreude at the Israelites suffering worse than that, then maybe it softens the notion that they were, punished as well in this plague. Let's actually get through this Rashi. So let's go back to Alan on Bechor Paro.
Bechor Paro ad Bechor Hashivcha Kol Hapechutim Bechor Paro V'Hashuvim Bechor Hashivcha Hayu Kichlal.
Okay, so translate, and then we're going to figure out what Rashi's question was once we understand his answer. We've kind of made reference to it, but what's his answer? Because it's not his question. His answer is?
From the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the slave woman.
Okay.
All those of lower status than the firstborn of Pharaoh, and Hashuvim more important or greater than the firstborn of the slave woman, were included. I guess, in what Pharaoh was told in the warning to Pharaoh.
So that's the answer. What's the question? What notion is Rashi trying to disabuse us of? Right. Lest you think that it's A and Z, it's from A to Z. Did any of us think that? No. But Rashi telling us, lest you did think of it, it's not that I'm going to smite everyone. I'm going to smite Pharaoh's son, and I'm also going to smite the son of the lowest servant in Egypt. But that's it. It doesn't mean that. I'm smiting from A to Z, a full merism. Okay. Keep going.
All right. Just an aside, Joel taught me that the word merism is not included in the Scrabble dictionary. You cannot use that when you're playing Scrabble.
Don't tell that to Elliot Dorff.
Okay.
You know that story, right? Yes. That first time I ever heard that word was under my chuppah. Elliot used that in a chuppah. And my father, who was a real word guy, had also never heard of the word. So maybe, he invented it. Okay.
V'lamelaku b'nei ha-shfachot. Why were the sons of the slave woman smitten, included in the plague? Sha'avhem hayu mishabdim bahem. Because they too, were dealing with. They were working as slaves. That's not right.
Correct. And so why were the maidservants smitten? that even though they, the maidservants, Hayu Mishabdim Bahem, were themselves enslaved or overworked by the Egyptians,
yes.
however,
Okay. Usmechim betzarat.
Sorry, I mistranslated that even the servants who were not themselves slaves but servants in Egyptian society, they were also participating in the oppression of the Israelites. They were Misha Abadim. It's a PL. They were also in their own way contributing to the degradation of the Israelites. Not only that, Usmechim.
And Usmechim, they were happy at their distress.
Right, which we know based on what verse? None. Right? It's like conjecture, right? And maybe Elon, I don't know if this is gonna be satisfying at all. That maybe it's Rashi's way of saying the only way this can possibly make sense is if we conjure a situation in which they were laughing at us and they were enjoying our degradation, because everyone likes to know that there's someone being treated worse than them. That's a very human condition, right? Look at the screen. So it exists according to Wikipedia, and the term, it's interesting, the term entered English in 1894 in the biological sense, but had appeared earlier in rhetorical context in which it noted synecdoche, in which totality is expressed by contrasting parts such as high and low, young and old.
I don't see Doris.
You don't see what? He really should be, as was noted in the August 26, 1999 wedding of Adam Kligfeld and Javi Dor. Elon.
So a couple of things. I agree with you. Clearly, Rashi put this in to make himself and his readers feel better.
And does he? Does it make you feel better?
No, because even if one accepts this explanation, I would say, okay, let's assume that what Rashi's saying is correct. It still seems disproportionate that one would punish a group of people for lack of a better term, mocking another group of people as severely as one would punish the Egyptians, who were clearly, and Pharaoh himself, who were clearly significantly more guilty, even as it's described here.
Yeah.
So that it's not it doesn't seem like an equitable punishment for their transgression.
That's a fair point. I'll tell you the sermon I would write about this Rashi, not the previous one. And it goes to my own experience, right? I've been very upfront about this. In end of elementary school and middle of middle school, I was bullied mercilessly, right? I was on the lowest place in the social strata. And then there was someone joined our class in 7th or 8th grade who had the following things going against him. He was very young for his class. He was Asian in a pretty much all white waspy school. He was exceedingly smart. He was exceedingly thin and nerdy in classical nerdy terms in the 80s. And he was sweet and soft and gentle. And therefore, all of a sudden, there was someone in my realm who could be more of a target than I was. And for more time that I'm proud of, I picked on him because it was the first time in my sense of self that I had the opportunity to have the upper hand. And at some point, I realized, even as a young person, I think it was 8th or 9th grade, how horrific that was, that I chose to do that. And did some real tshuva with him and made amends. And then he actually left the school in 9th or 10th grade, but we left on excellent terms. I remember visiting him at his new school because he had a musical recital, and I became a friend of his, and we're still friends on Facebook today. He might even be watching this moment. Right? And it's one of the things in my life that I'm most ashamed of. I guess I'm proud that I realized it, but I'm most ashamed of. And the sermon is that even if you're the second to the lowest rung, it gives you no license to do to the one below you what is being done to you. And God or circumstances will get you for it, right? Do you deserve to have your first child be executed as a result? No. But there's a sermon in this comment, right? That if we imagine, and it's all imagination, that these servants of Egypt contributed in their own more milder way to our subjugation, yeah, then karma is going to come get them at some point. You have no license to do that, even if you're mostly oppressed by everyone else in the system. Tova, and then Leonard. And if you're listening to this, my old friend, I'm still sorry.
Yeah, really riding on your final comments there, the historical analysis of Jews in the South often and how they assumed a role there and basically embraced the institution. Part of the psychology was that. And in a similar way, when the Irish came into the country and in the face of their own abuse, adopted the
Tova, I don't remember. Were you on our trip to the South?
No, I wasn't.
Those who were, the most striking moment I had in that trip was the Museum of Southern Jewish Life in New Orleans. Is that where it was? Yeah. Where there was a whole display of how Pesach was observed during the Civil War, including, and I've made reference to this before, so you've heard it, I apologize for the redundancy, a beautiful letter written by a general in the army about how proud he was at being able to provide matzah to his soldiers for Passover in 1862. Jewish general of the Confederacy. So he was a general in the Confederacy that was proud of his ability to allow his Jewish soldiers to celebrate the festival of freedom from slavery while he was contributing to a military action to preserve slavery. Right? That's a horrific and wonderful datum when it comes to what the human condition is really like. Right, Leonard.
So we're asking, or Rashi's asking the question here, why the firstborn of the slaves? But you could also ask the same question, why the firstborn of the Egyptians? So it's like all of them weren't responsible for this. Pharaoh was responsible for this. For that matter, why the firstborn of Pharaoh? He didn't do it.
As opposed to Pharaoh.
Yes.
Yeah, right. It's so interesting, Leonard. I so appreciate the comment that we're now 57 minutes into this class, and it's the first time that's at least bubbled up to the surface. Like we accept the force, of course, that the Pharaoh's child will be killed, but why others, right? We're so used to the story that should have been the first horror, right? And Rashi's disinterested in that. Tova?
I actually wanted to ask about that in the beginning because one of the later tenets of halacha is that you are only responsible for your own crime. Yeah. And that was arguably or historically minded a pushback against Hammurabi's eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, to deny that. And yet
it's a pretty brutal punishment. Let's finish the Rashi so we can say we did at least one Rashi today. Alan, and now, and what about the poor cattle?
Yes. B'chor behema. Why? It's all the firstborn of the animal or the cattle, however you want to translate it. Why were they killed? The fisha you ovdin la, because the Egyptians viewed them as gods. They worshipped it.
Right, and the word la is feminine singular because it references specifically the word behema.
Yeah.
So it's not it's them, but the them in the verse is a single feminine word, behema, like cattle, refers to a multiplicity, even though the word looks like it's singular, okay? Because the Egyptians would worship that category of animal,
okay,
which we had reference to earlier on in the plagues.
Okay. Keshakadosh Baruch Hu nifra min ha'uma of the Chochavim nifra me'eloheha, because when the Holy One, blessed be God, wants
exact
punishment.
That's how you would have to say it in English to make the preposition mean make sense.
Yeah.
Exacts punishment from
the idolatrous nation. God exacts punishment from its gods as well.
Do you have the word idolatrous in the Hebrew there?
No, I have it in brackets.
That hunifra min ha'uma. What's the next word in Hebrew? Ovdei. Interesting. Okay, because my version has just when God exacts punishment from an ummah, which is just a reference to a nation, then its gods also get smitten as well.
We have Ovdei Kochavim in the brackets.
So it's not fair to the cows that they're worshipped by the Egyptians, but they are, and therefore they're semi-deities, and therefore they get shmeisted as well, or their children get shmeisted. Right? This is big stuff, right? This is it's like fascinating and rich and disturbing to go so slowly on the story we know so well. We know it so well, but we don't know it. Right? We don't, and we certainly don't know it for all of its contours and all the things it's supposed to be teaching us, and our guesses as what it was supposed to be teaching us then. Right? That's what's really interesting about this. Whatever your understanding of the origin, the theology of Torah, why do these verses exist? What is it supposed to awaken within us? What is it supposed to be activating us to think about or do? Right? Someone has a hand up, Larry, Diane, then you'll have the last comment.
Diane was going to make this comment earlier, and I told her not to. And I don't think anybody has actually made the comment, but there's an undercurrent here for contemporary times. At least I read it. But how do we approach the putative suffering of the innocents or putative innocence? I don't think I have to say anything more.
I think it's hovering in everyone's consciousness, and it has been for about a year as we've been studying this material during this war. You're right. We don't have to say anything about it because we're all saying things about it in our minds, and almost the attempt to say something pithy about it will kind of ruin the conjecture. But it's right there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good week, everyone. Be good to yourselves and to one another. Bye.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.